In October 1983, the quiet town of Sherman, Texas, awoke to a crime scene that would haunt the state for decades. Inside a small airplane hangar on a rural ranch for men, a builder, a sheriff's deputy, a designer, and a former police officer were found shot dead, execution style. The victims, Bob Tate, Philip Good, Jerry Brown, and Ronald Mays, all respected members of their community, all gone in a single night. The discovery shocked law enforcement across Texas. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, only a missing ultralight aircraft and a trail of unanswered questions. Investigators soon turned their attention to a man who seemed the least likely suspect, Lester Leroy Bower Jr., a 36-year-old chemical salesman from Arlington, Texas. A husband, a father, and a man who had never been in trouble with the law. But when pieces of the missing aircraft were found inside his garage, and phone records linked him to one of the victims, Bower's life changed forever. What began as a simple aircraft sale would become one of the longest and most debated murder cases in Texas history. For more than 30 years, Lester Bower sat on death row, claiming his innocence, while prosecutors insisted the evidence spoke for itself. And when the day finally came, on June 3, 2015, at the Huntsville unit in Texas, the 67-year-old faced his fate with quiet defiance. He had no special last meal. Texas had already banned that privilege, but his final words were unforgettable. He said, "Much has been said about this case. Much has been written about this case. Not all of it has been the truth. But the time for discerning truth is over, and it's time to move on." To understand how a respected family man became the oldest person executed in modern Texas history, and why so many still question whether justice was truly served, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us as we uncover the story behind the Texas ranch hangar murders, a case that questions guilt, truth, and the limits of justice itself. Before he became one of Texas's most debated death row inmates, Lester Leroy Bower Jr. was the kind of man most people trusted without a second thought. Born on November 20th, 1947, in Arlington, Texas, Bower grew up in a modest home where hard work, honesty, and family values were a way of life. Friends remembered him as intelligent, polite, and deeply devoted to his wife and daughters. He worked as a chemical salesman, a job that required long drives across the state, visiting clients and building business relationships one handshake at a time. He was known for being dependable, the kind of man who kept his word, paid his bills, and stayed out of trouble. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and by all accounts, lived a picture of a quiet, middle-class American life. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a quiet passion, a love for aviation. Lester spent his free time building and flying ultralight aircraft, small recreational planes made for hobby pilots. To him, flying wasn't just a pastime, it was freedom, a way to escape the grind of everyday life and feel a sense of control among the clouds. Friends said he could talk for hours about engines, aerodynamics, and the thrill of flight. That passion would eventually draw him to the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. In early October of 1983, Bower came across an advertisement for an ultralight aircraft that caught his attention. He reached out to Philip Good, a Grayson County Sheriff's deputy who helped arrange the sale. Through Good, Bower connected with Bob Tate, a respected local contractor who owned a small ranch just outside Sherman, Texas, a ranch with a private hangar that would serve as their meeting spot. The plan seemed simple. Drive up from Arlington, take a look at the plane, pay in cash, and head home. But that short business trip, less than an hour and a half north of Dallas, would become the center of a mystery that baffled investigators for decades. On that day in October, Lester Bower entered the hangar expecting to purchase his dream aircraft. What happened inside remains one of the most disputed events in Texas criminal history, because by nightfall, 4 men would be dead, and a respected family man would soon find himself accused of one of the most shocking murders the state had ever seen. On the morning of October 8, 1983, what began as an ordinary Saturday on a quiet Texas ranch would become the scene of one of the most brutal and perplexing crimes in state history. Inside the hangar of Bob Tate, a 51-year-old contractor and well-known local businessman, investigators discovered a horror they could barely comprehend. The bodies of 4 men, each lying face down, each shot once in the head with what appeared to be the precision of an execution. The victims were identified as Bob Tate, the ranch owner, Philip Good, a 29-year-old sheriff's deputy and father of 2, Jerry Brown, a 52-year-old interior designer from Dallas, and Ronald Mays, a 39-year-old former police officer. These were not strangers or drifters. They were well-respected men, each with families, each connected by a shared passion for aviation. Their meeting that day was supposed to be about an ultralight aircraft, a hobby project that had brought them together. Instead, it ended in bloodshed. Authorities have yet to identify a suspect in what's being called the worst multiple homicide in Grayson County history. Investigators are combing through evidence, but details remain scarce. The killing sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community. This wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors at night. Families knew one another by name. Deputies were friends, not just lawmen. The fact that one of their own, Deputy Good, was among the dead made the case even more personal and even more urgent. The sheriff's department launched a massive investigation, determined to find whoever was behind the massacre. But as they scoured the scene, something caught their attention, or rather, something that wasn't there. An ultralight aircraft, which the victims had been assembling and testing, was missing. It was the only item of significant value taken from the hangar. To investigators, that missing plane was more than a clue. It was a possible motive. If they could find the ultralight, they believed they'd find the killer. As the bodies were removed and the evidence logged, rumors began to spread. Was a robbery gone wrong? A drug deal? Or something much more calculated? No one could imagine that a man from nearly 80 miles away, a quiet family man with a steady job, would soon become the center of this storm. But in just a matter of weeks, the investigation would lead detectives straight to Lester Leroy Bower Jr., and the small town of Sherman would never be the same again. In the days that followed the gruesome discovery at Bob Tate's ranch, investigators faced a daunting challenge. For men dead, no eyewitnesses, no weapon, and no clear motive. The hangar offered few clues, no fingerprints, no shell casings, no forced entry. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. But then, a small detail began to stand out. A trail of telephone calls that linked one of the victims, Deputy Philip Good, to a man nearly 80 miles away, Lester Leroy Bower Jr. Phone records revealed a series of calls made from Bower's home to Good's number shortly before the murders. Calls that prosecutors would later argue were used to arrange a meeting for the sale of an ultralight aircraft. When detectives drove to Bower's quiet home in Arlington, they were greeted by a polite, cooperative man who willingly allowed a search of his property. What they found inside, however, changed everything. Hidden among the clutter of Bower's garage were several aircraft components that appeared strikingly similar to the missing ultralight from the hangar, distinctive parts that investigators believed matched those described by the victims' friends. To police, it looked like the missing aircraft and a possible motive had finally surfaced. When questioned, Bower admitted that he had indeed driven to the hangar to meet the men, confirming that he had purchased the ultralight for cash. But he insisted that when he left that day, all 4 men were alive. He claimed he had simply transported the aircraft home, as agreed, and had nothing to do with the murders. To him, the case was a tragic coincidence. To the investigators, it was the break they'd been waiting for. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors began building a narrative, one they believed explained everything. According to their theory, Bower had gone to the hangar under the pretense of buying the ultralight, but when the deal turned sour, he pulled out a gun, killed all 4 men, and stole the plane to eliminate witnesses. They argued he then dismantled it piece by piece to hide the evidence. Prosecutors alleged that Bower killed the 4 men to steal the aircraft and cover his tracks. Authorities say new evidence ties him directly to the missing plane. Within weeks, the quiet family man from Arlington had become the prime suspect in a quadruple homicide that shocked Texas. To the public, it seemed like an open and shut case. But behind the scenes, questions were already forming. Questions about what really happened inside that hangar and whether investigators were too quick to decide who the killer was. In April 1984, the small-town courthouse in Sherman, Texas, became the stage for one of the most talked-about murder trials in the state's history. The defendant, Lester Leroy Bower Jr., a soft-spoken chemical salesman with no prior criminal record. The charge, 4 counts of capital murder. Over 2 tense weeks, prosecutors pieced together what they called a chain of undeniable circumstantial evidence linking Bower to the gruesome killings at Bob Tate's hangar. Prosecutors argued that Bower's motive was simple greed. They claimed he murdered Bob Tate, Deputy Philip Good, Jerry Brown, and Ronald Mays to steal the ultralight aircraft and conceal his crime. Their case relied heavily on the phone records, testimony about aircraft parts found at his home, and statements suggesting Bower had lied about the timing of his visit to the hangar. But despite the grave accusations, something crucial was missing. There were no fingerprints tying him to the scene, no murder weapon recovered, and no eyewitness who saw him commit the crime. The defense fought to dismantle the state's theory, arguing that the prosecution's case was built entirely on speculation. Bower's attorney pointed out that the ultralight aircraft was legally purchased and that the parts found at his home were consistent with his aviation hobby, not with stolen property. They reminded the jury that not one drop of physical evidence tied their client to the murders. No blood, no fibers, no shell casings. Still, the prosecution's story painted a chilling picture: a man who planned a robbery turned slaughter. After days of deliberation, the jury faced an agonizing choice: believe the man who swore he was innocent, or accept the prosecution's web of circumstantial links as proof beyond reasonable doubt. When a verdict came, the courtroom fell silent. One by one, the jurors confirmed their decision. On April 13, 1984, after a 2-week trial, the jury found Lester Bower guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death for the slayings of Bob Tate, Philip Good, Jerry Brown, and Ronald Mays. To the state, justice had been served. To many observers, the case was far from clear. The verdict rested entirely on circumstantial evidence: a paper trail of phone calls, some aircraft parts, and the prosecution's interpretation of motive. But in a Texas courtroom, it was enough to condemn a man to die. As Bower disappeared behind the heavy steel doors of the county jail, his wife and 2 daughters wept quietly in the back of the courtroom. For them, it was the beginning of a decades-long battle to prove his innocence, a fight that would stretch across 3 decades, through appeals, execution stays, and mounting questions about whether Texas had convicted the wrong man. For the next 31 years, Lester Leroy Bower Jr. lived inside a 6-by-9-foot cell on Texas death row, one of the longest continuous stays in the state's modern history. Day after day, he woke to the same sound of cell doors clanging shut and footsteps echoing down concrete corridors. Over the decades, he filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal, maintaining the same claim he had made since 1983, that he was innocent, that he did not kill those 4 men in the Grayson County hangar. Bower became a fixture on death row, an aging man in a world designed for the condemned. His correspondence with reporters, lawyers, and even pen pals from across the country revealed not a hardened killer, but a man quietly fighting time, bureaucracy, and an unyielding system. Then, in 1989, a twist in the story emerged, one that cast new doubt on the state's original case. In a stunning revelation, a woman came forward claiming that her ex-boyfriend and his associates, not Bower, had confessed to the killings years earlier. According to her sworn affidavit, the 4 victims were involved in a drug deal gone wrong, and the murders were meant to silence witnesses. Her story matched several unexplained details in the case, including the professional, execution-style nature of the shootings. But when she finally spoke up, it had been too long. The courts dismissed her statement as hearsay and unreliable, refusing to reopen the case. Cut to the woman's public interview footage, her face shadowed for anonymity. Overlaid news quotes read. She said she stayed silent out of fear. Her story challenges the original timeline and motive. As the years passed, more cracks began to form in the state's theory. experts revisited the ballistics evidence. Ammunition that prosecutors once claimed was rare and unique to Bower's gun was later proven to be anything but. The same type of bullets could be bought at sporting goods stores across Texas during the 1980s, raising serious doubts about the original forensic testimony. Still, every appeal met the same fate: denial. Through it all, Bower remained calm, articulate, and steadfast. He continued to write letters, mentor other inmates, and maintain contact with his family, particularly his wife, Sherry, who spent years fighting to prove his innocence. To those who knew him, Bower was not a monster, but a man caught in a legal machine, unwilling to admit it might have made a mistake. Yet the clock never stopped ticking. As his health declined and the years turned into decades, the reality became impossible to ignore. Texas was not going to let him leave death row alive. By the time his final appeals reached the U.S. Supreme Court, Lester Bower had spent more than half his life waiting for an execution date. His case had drawn national attention, stirring debates about wrongful convictions, the reliability of circumstantial evidence, and the human cost of time itself. But as the years dwindled, one thing became clear. The state of Texas was ready to carry out the sentence it had handed down 3 decades earlier. In the summer of 2015, after more than 3 decades of appeals, stays, and uncertainty, the long fight of Lester Leroy Bower Jr. finally came to an end. The date was June 3, 2015. The location, the Huntsville unit, the oldest prison in Texas and the site of hundreds of state executions. Bower, now 67 years old, had spent more than half his life confined to death row, his case having become one of the longest in Texas history. After countless petitions and last-minute pleas for mercy, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal. With that single decision, the countdown began. As news spread that his execution was officially scheduled, media trucks lined the streets outside. Advocates, friends, and even some of the victims' relatives gathered quietly across the road, each with their own version of justice. Bower had maintained his innocence to the end, telling his attorneys and those who visited that he bore no hatred toward anyone, not even the people who condemned him. By the time his final day arrived, he had outlived nearly everyone else on Texas death row. Under Texas law, special last meal requests were abolished in 2011 after a previous inmate's excess sparked controversy. That meant that on his final evening, Lester Bower received whatever the general population was served: a humble, unremarkable meal marking the end of an extraordinary legal battle. There was no luxury, no ceremony, no indulgence, only quiet acceptance. At 6:36 p.m., Bower was escorted into the execution chamber. Dressed in a white prison uniform, he lay down on the gurney, calm and composed. Witnesses later described him as soft-spoken, his voice steady as he delivered his final statement, not of anger, but of peace. According to the official Department of Criminal Justice report, at precisely 6:36 p.m., after a brief prayer and a few last words to his family, Bower received the lethal injection of pentobarbital, a fast-acting barbiturate that slows the heartbeat and breathing until both stop. Within minutes, his eyes closed. Moments later, the warden announced what had been delayed for more than 3 decades. Time of death, 6:36 p.m. He was at 67 years old, the oldest prisoner executed in modern Texas history. For some, his execution marked long-awaited closure to a horrific crime that had haunted Grayson County since 1983. For others, it was a somber reminder of the flaws and finality of the death penalty, an irreversible act in a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. Whether guilty or innocent, Bower's death closed one of the longest-running chapters in Texas death row history. Moments before the lethal injection flowed through his veins, Lester Leroy Bower Jr. turned his head slightly toward the glass, his voice calm and deliberate. After decades of appeals, accusations, and unrelenting doubt, he chose his final words carefully, not of anger, not of vengeance, but of acceptance. He said softly, "Much has been said about this case. Much has been written about this case. Not all of it has been the truth, but the time for discerning truth is over, and it's time to move on. With those final words, Bower closed his eyes, exhaling a final breath that carried the weight of 31 years spent in a cell and a lifetime overshadowed by doubt. There was no anger, no plea, no dramatic confession, only the quiet resignation of a man who had long made peace with his fate. In that moment, the line between guilt and innocence blurred forever, leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered and a silence that still lingers in the corridors of Texas justice. Final statement, June 3, 2015, Huntsville Unit, Texas. He maintained his innocence until the end. What do you think? After 3 decades of appeals, conflicting stories, and a conviction built on circumstantial evidence, was justice truly served in the case of Lester Leroy Bower Jr.? Or did Texas execute a man who was never proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? His calm final words, "The time for discerning truth is over," still echo as a haunting reminder of how fragile truth and justice can be when the evidence is not clear and time becomes the greatest adversary of all. In the end, the facts remain debated, the questions unanswered, and the truth buried somewhere between the courtroom and the execution chamber. If stories like this remind us of anything, it's that the pursuit of justice is not always as clear-cut as it seems. Behind every headline, every verdict, and every execution, there's a deeper question, one that forces us to confront what justice truly means. So we ask you, what do you believe? Did the system deliver justice, or did it fail an innocent man? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Report Network for more real, documented true crime stories that dive deep into the cases, the people, and the final moments that changed history forever. Until next time, stay informed and stay vigilant. Television Crime Report Network, where every case has a voice.